Okay, good morning, everyone. A very big welcome back to Inyathelo's talks. And I'm really pleased to see such a great crowd because this is a really very important issue. The reason why Inyathelo is getting involved in this issue is that one of our objectives is to strengthen the sustainability of civil society organizations. And the enabling environment is critical to that sustainability. So it's within our remit to explore, debate, make submissions, get involved with any kinds of issues that affect our ability to function. And so when we saw there was a new framework around changing the NPO Act, we made it our business just to keep an eye on it. The process around engaging with civil society has been something we have concern about. Constitutionally, I think, the Department of Social Development is meant to engage very fully, and they seem to have engaged with a very small group of organizations, mainly those who they fund. And we all know civil society is much broader than service delivery organizations that are funded by government. And so there's a whole swathe of non-profits who work in a huge range of interests beyond welfare, who have not been brought into this process. So we've done the research, and what we're doing today is opening this up for debate, and we've brought in people who know something about this.
I want to just jump right in and ask the question, what is this law which is being proposed intended to do? What is the harm that is intended to be remedied? And I think there are two main harms that we are looking at here. The one is the question of fraud. To what extent are we managing and containing fraud in the non-profit sector? And to what extent is the not-for-profit sector becoming a tool for terrorists? And I think those are the two harms which are really the focus of this legislation. It seems as though in terms of that first question is what is the harm that we're trying to remedy, it does seem to be a harm that everybody's very aware of and concerned about. But when I asked for the evidence as to how widespread it is, that really wasn't forthcoming. So I think that would be one of my questions is there a real threat to the sector in relation to fraud? Non-profits need to tighten up their governance, and governments need to increase regulation of non-profits because of the concern that they're going to be used as platforms for terrorism. For the people in the room, the question of NPO governance is maybe not the sexiest sounding topic. And, you might, you're here, so you do find it interesting. But I think for many of us, with the day-to-day press of programs and projects and, dealing with beneficiaries and kind of all the stuff that we do every day, that there's a tendency to push the stuff onto the back burner and say, we'll deal with that another day. An enabling environment for civil society is really the foundation from which we operate. And without that, we can't do anything. Keep engaging around this issue and make sure that it doesn't fall off the stove and that we do keep it, if not quite at the back, at least, on the boil towards the front part of the stove as a hot topic. Thank you.
I think I have probably come at it from quite a different viewpoint and standpoint. I think that firstly, I think that the fifth version is it's very different. It has acknowledged the many issues that were raised after the first version of the framework. I also want to just say that it's not actually legislation. It's a policy document that would guide any changes to the legislation. So the fifth version is actually quite vague about the actual changes to the legislation. Until we really have a good understanding of what the sector looks like, it's going to be very hard to plan and make new laws to govern that. So I think that's a very positive thing that's in the framework is the acknowledgement that not enough is known and that more research needs to be done. The reasons behind this framework was really an acknowledgement that the system as it is not working. I we believe firmly that the system of having two separate registration, requirements, NPO and PBO, is hugely burdensome, particularly for smaller organizations. On top of the existing requirements, based on what type of organization you are. If you're an NPC, you have to comply with the Companies Act. If you're a trust, you have other things that you need to comply with. So I think that that's great, but I even think that it needs to go further. I think that the department needs to really look at using USSD and SMS and other ways of engaging civil society organizations who are not able to use the technology, with an online registration facility, which it talks about. I don't believe that. I don't think that regulation is necessarily control, and I don't believe. I'm sorry, I disagree with you that fraud is the main issue. To me, it's more about trust, and a lot of research shows that donors, in particular, the biggest stumbling block and barrier for individual givers is a bad experience with an organization, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's about fraud or criminal. It means that they just don't feel like their money that they donated has been spent in the way that it should have been, or that the organization is running efficiently, or that those kinds of things. So I think I'm not suggesting that. What I'm basically saying is I don't think that self-regulation has worked in the way that it was intended, and I do think that governance is something that we do need to look at, not just to avoid fraud, but to avoid to rebuild the trust between organizations and the donors. I don't have I support the creation of an independent regulator, but I don't think that it should be sitting within the Department of Social Development, and for the reason that they're the major funder, and I think that there's a conflict there.
I'm going to ask Mapena first just to speak and to perhaps respond a little to some of the issues that have come up and add any new things.
Currently, we are on the 6th version of the proposal to amend the NPO Act. The framework itself, as Elliot alluded, that is all about how can we amend the current provisions in the legislation. We have been asked by Cabinet to prepare this framework so as we should give the country a sense in terms of what we want to amend. And essentially that is. I'm quite disturbed in the way that it has been presented here, selectively, and it's almost like scary stuff. Safe to say that the document itself, when you read it, it acknowledges, amongst other things, the coexisting of self-regulation and state regulation. It further acknowledged the fact that we are currently dealing with structural issues in civil society. We are almost living in a society wherein what the former president would have termed two-nation state, wherein you've got a lot of organizations, close to about 80% of organizations currently do not have the ability to comply with the current provisions. And thirdly, as well also, we acknowledge the fact that the enabling environment that has been originally been intended for civil society has not been comfortable. That's why, even so as well also, we reference empirical evidence in the form of a report or a research that was conducted in 2005, including as well also benchmarking governances in non-profit organizations. The notion that mandatory governance rules is either here or there. When you read currently the current provisions of the legislation, particularly section 12.2, it makes requirements for those kinds of things. The document as it currently stands is just a reiteratory and an emphasis on that we explore possibility of maintaining those provisions. It's nothing unbecoming. It's not scary at all. The notion that the amendments have been informed by fraud and anti-money laundering is not even there as well also. We have been the voice in the wilderness, more especially South Africa, pertaining to anti-money laundering and particularly anti-terrorism. When you visit the site of FedTech, it will show you the peer review that South Africa have undergone, and we completely rejected all those other notions of compulsory registration, for example, of all non-profit organizations. South Africa was instrumental in terms of changing the mindset in terms of how we should view this matter pertaining to anti-money and anti-terrorism financing. We do believe that we've got enough legislation and the regime is enough to deal with those kinds of things. Through both, there is a specific legislation, for example, and the Financial Intelligence Act as well also deal with that matters. The idea of registration for foreign organizations, yes, indeed, it is a concern. We take the point that more discussions needs to be done, particularly with the definitional issues around that. Importantly is that we flag the matter and it's a concern. South Africa is under pressure to do something pertaining to some measures around that. The policy document as it currently stands is still a draft policy document. It's not a government document per se. It's a draft for discussion. It will go through the public policy processes. Amongst other things, it will still be consulted as much as possible. And after that, it will then be approved as a white paper. After Cabinet has approved it, and it will still continue going through a vigorous consultation process. And then thereafter, then we engage the state attorneys to amend the legislation. I thank you. There is nothing to scare about it. It's not the intention of the legislation. Please take us in confidence.
I'm going to get right to the point. I come from a history of working with civil society organizations, social movements, community organizations, which are often outside of the purview of the NPO Directorate. And I want to talk about the politics behind this, because I think it's naive in the extreme to try to approach this as if it's some kind of bureaucratic, simply government-initiated, well-intentioned effort to try to regulate the NPO sector, because that is ahistorical, first of all. Where did the problem within the NPO sector begin with? It began after the adoption in the 90s of the NPO Act itself. If one reads that act, it was very specific of what government's supposed role was supposed to be, which was to support all of civil society organizations, not simply service providers, not simply those that are filling in policy gaps, but all, in other words, community organizations, those that are most under-resourced and so forth and so on. That did not happen. In fact, the opposite happened. What then was the case? A funding crisis. Where did the NPO sector then have to turn? To the private sector, to foreign funding. This was a self-constructed situation. It didn't have to necessarily happen that way in those contexts. And then what we have is we have a situation where, politically, what we have is the ruling party and many government officials beginning to express disquiet over the political role of certain civil society organizations and their criticism of government policy. And this is not new to South Africa at all. You see it all over the world, in our neighbors as well as in the West, where it begins with a critique of, well, you know, you're being a little bit extreme. You're being ultra-left. You're being this. You're not being patriotic. Then it becomes you're receiving foreign funds. Then it becomes the Minister of Intelligence getting in front of Parliament 2 years ago and saying that the Right to Know campaign is funded by foreign spy agencies and is trying to undermine the integrity of the state. And so this is the background, the political background, and it's disingenuous to try to present this as apolitical. There should be more oversight and support for the CSO sector. In other words, let the NPO Directorate do its job. Fine. Give it more capacity to do that job. But when you become talking about issues of foreign NGOs and compulsory registration, and also the practical reality, whether or not it's in the proposals, of the interpretation of those proposals with regards to organizations that are fundamentally critical and that mobilize against government policies and the way that then they get treated, we can see where that has gone with other pieces of legislation. If we talk about trust, accountability, and transparency, it has to cut both ways. You cannot tell civil society that they must be accountable and trusting when government agencies themselves are not practicing what they preach. It's not going to go down very well. So if you want trust and accountability of things, and civil society is pointing that out in government, well, it's a quid pro quo. It has to cut both ways. We must have a critical engagement. We can't approach this as some kind of neutral situation. It's healthy. It's democratic to have this good debate now. Decisions exist with regards to what is not in the legislation and what is the reality. So let's have that debate. That's what I think we're interested in from a situation of activists coming from the grassroots. Thank you.
I think the advent of this policy paper and its broad themes have given rise to considerable concern. It is an extremely difficult job to define legislation in which government, whilst performing its legitimate role, does not intrude on the terrain of civil society. Because fundamentally, we are non-governmental organizations. And therefore, there's a fundamental conundrum. How does government regulate non-government? And this requires a great deal of subtlety and care, because the independence of civil society, its very nature, is a seminal principle and a fundamental aspect to a democracy, and it has to be very carefully nurtured and protected. I think of great concern has been not merely the product, if you like, but the process, because I think that I must confess my own perhaps surprise, only became aware of this consultative process tangentially. There was no invitation of which I was aware, and many organizations with which I was in contact, significant organizations playing important roles, and I would include Inyathelo itself, only discovered the existence of a consultative process, and in many cases were not part of those discussions. So that the genesis, the birth process, has been problematic. And it's not too late. We're into the 5th or the 6th draft. So we're dealing with a generalized policy statement. We're not yet looking at a bill, and therefore it is difficult for us to engage, but it is very important that we do so. We need to remind the Directorate that its fundamental and essential and most valuable role is that which is set out in the existing Act. In other words, to be an enabler, to empower, not to be the policeman or the investigator, but to basically to empower. And thus we see, for example, that Section 3 says that within the limits prescribed by law, every organ of state, and that includes itself, every organ of state must determine and coordinate the implementation of its policies and measures in a manner designed to promote, support, and enhance the capacity of non-profit organizations to perform their functions. I would encourage that to be the focus of the legislation, rather than this, what one is afraid may develop into some kind of a intrusive and oppressive bureaucracy.
So from now on, we are going to open this to the floor. And I know we've got 2 panelists sitting in the front, but if you want to direct your question to Alison or Sophie, please say so, and we'll ask them to stand.
This was a question for Sophie, actually. You said that the 5th draft was very different to the 3rd draft on which the research report was primarily based. In our experience and in the comparison that we did, they are basically the same document with some slightly softened language. So I wondered if you would perhaps just speak to that.
That wasn't my reading of the 2 documents at all. The first version was quite specific about St. Potri and St. Pora and went into quite some detail. And the fifth version, doesn't speak about that. It really just goes right at the end. So I'm sorry, maybe it's a perception thing, but I felt that the fifth version, I haven't seen the sixth versions, but the fifth version that I saw, in my opinion, took on board a lot of the concerns that had been expressed by the sector, and was at quite some pains, I felt, to allay the fears of the sector that this policy framework was an attempt to control or in some way influence. That was my perception.
When you read the MPO legislation, there are essentially two institutions that have been mandated to do this set of work. First is the MPO Directorate that acts as the registrar or as the regulator in terms of registration and in terms of compliance or checking whether organizations do indeed submit their annual reports, including as well also to make that readily available to the public. The other component that relates to the legislation is the panel of arbitrators, as Sheila has alluded to. There is an existing structure, those two. When you read the sixth version, there's nothing that have changed around those two structures. Instead, it begins to argue that the state rather has undermined or underestimated rather the work that needs to be involved pertaining to those functions. It has not been capacitated and capitalized accordingly in terms of what is the requisite resources for it to do the work. The framework begins to make a case to say that we need to have at least some kind of independence around that, including as well also their decisions to be reviewed, like any other decision in South Africa to be reviewed by a court.
Cool. So it's not so much a question as it is a comment. So I work with about 20 nonprofits, and maybe that are registered, and maybe an additional about 60 that are not registered and are thinking about it. And this is the first we've heard of this process. So thank you to Inyathelo, because you help us be part of what government is doing. So it's interesting that government is saying that there's a public process of letting us know what they're doing. We haven't been exposed to that public process. However, I have to say this, government knows how to get a hold of us when they think we haven't submitted our report. So I know that they have my email address, but they haven't let me know about their drafts, which is a bit of a concern to me, because most of my nonprofits will say the same thing. So we submit all our reports and everything, so they know to get a hold of me. The Department of Social Development systems are flawed. So their reporting system is flawed. Their receiving of reports is flawed. So they're now introducing more systems that I think they'll just be flawed. So you are adding more flaws to your flaws, and you want us to support it, and that's a concern to me.
We have recommendations that's come out of the research project, and they're up there. Maybe in light of some of the debate today, we may wish to change or keep them. What would be great is to have some kind of working group which could start looking at this framework from civil society, so that we've got some kind of structure that can engage with government. Because at the moment, it's very much a one-way thing, government reaching out, trying to explain, and everybody more or less on their own without any kind of real voice. There are different structures in civil society, umbrella organizations that can do this on their own, but we just kind of felt we've got a good audience here. There are a lot of people who wanted to come and couldn't, and so if there are any volunteers to work with us so that there is open engagement on this, I think that would be great, and they can contact Janine, who is our coordinator dealing with our advocacy and governance issues. I would really like to thank everyone on the panel who came. I think the discussion has been incredibly useful, and I'm sorry, this could have been a whole day's workshop. And maybe once the working group has got going and we've engaged more fully with government, that might be an option. But I would really like to thank the panel. I think it's been a very, very useful discussion ranging from the technical side of it to the political side. And I'd also like to thank Diane and Thulia and Sarah, who were the main movers in organizing this, as well as the rest of the Inyathelo team, who always participate and pull together.